Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today at Global Genes Live, a Rare Patient Advocacy Summit. We're very excited for our upcoming session, which is about proactive planning for continuity of research during a crisis, something where it's all close to a lot of us. And my name is Nina Wachsman. I am going to be the moderator, and I am the founder and president of No Rare. So just a few minutes before we get started, I just want to review a few housekeeping notes with everybody. First of all the attendees are going to be muted by the moderator to reduce any interruptions, but we encourage you to use the chat function on the On24 window for any questions you may have throughout the session, and then the team will present the questions to the speakers. So to open the chat, please just click on the blue chat button located on the meeting controls at the bottom of the screen. If there are questions that are not able to be addressed by the speakers because the time is too short, we will do our best to follow up with you guys after the program. Also, please make sure to post your top takeaways and fun moments during the Global Genes Live on social media and tag @GlobalGenes for a chance to be featured on our social media channels. The event hashtag is hashtag 2020 GG Summit. Finally, we encourage you all to participate as active listeners and take advantage of the opportunity to hear from some leaders and experts here and ask questions or make comments. This program is your time to learn and find answers on critical issues and challenges in rare disease clinical research. So I'm going to welcome our panelists today, Gerald Mosely, who is the founder and principal of CPP Development. Gerald, you want to say hi?
Hi, good morning, good day, everyone.
And Phuong Dao, Director of Research Operations at Children's Hospital of Orange County, otherwise known as CHOC. And then they will share a little bit more complete background as we get into our conversation. But for now, I'm going to invite Heidi to kick things off. Okay. I am going to go ahead, I guess. Ooh. Do we want to have some introductions? So Gerald, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll go on to our, go ahead. Hello?
Okay, so hi, I'm Gerald. As I said, thank you very much, Nina. My pleasure to be with all of you today. I am the founder, as Nina said, of CPP Development. It's a specialty management consulting practice that's focused on leaders and teams and really trying to focus on what are some of the people-related aspects to help you drive performance and engagement. I come with a background of over 20 years in the pharmaceutical business, working in different areas, leading teams of different sizes and types kind of globally. So I'm looking forward to spending some time telling you what I think is a very important thing that we should consider when we're looking at these trials in this time.
Okay, Phuong, do you want to introduce yourself? Oh. Phuong, I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, good morning.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. My name is Phuong Dao. Thank you, Nina. I'm the Director of Research Operations for CHOC Children's. My role is to support in the planning and implementation of both investigator-initiated and industry-initiated protocols at our site.
Okay, and then lastly, I'll introduce myself. I'm Nina Wachsman. I've been working in the healthcare environment for a very long time with my partner, who is my son, Jake Wachsman. And we got involved in rare disease when my grandson, Jake's nephew, was diagnosed with a very ultra-rare disease. And in getting into the rare disease community, we found out about how difficult it is for people with a rare disease to connect with researchers and research. And then learning from our clients on the pharma side, we heard that the pharmaceutical industry is always looking for people to participate in studies and can't always find them. So we made it our mission to try to work to connect people with rare disease to clinical researchers. And we've started a platform called No Rare, which attempts to do that. So that's about all of us. So we've all been working in the research environment for a while. Gerald was a researcher, and Phuong is actively involved in research, and I'm trying to do, and my team is doing clinical research, trying to recruit patients in rare disease for clinical research. So we wanted to get started to look at some of the things that have happened during the recent pandemic and what are the lessons learned for going ahead in the future. So just looking at, we just wanted to put a couple of slides we put together as thought starters. So the first thing we wanted to mention is everybody knows what happened when the two big sports areas decided to go back to be activated after the pandemic. There was Major League Baseball that just winged it and just got started, and they had to pull back. And then there was the NBA, which had created a 125-page document with guidelines for how they could activate the teams and keep playing. And they put teams in the bubble. They had every contingency planned. And we know what happened with them. So the games are going on NBA, and the MLB had to stop. So looking at that, we all see things that have happened across the pandemic, and there's some new realities that have happened because of that. One of the things I think we've all experienced, and I've experienced it myself, is that it's very hard to get a doctor's appointment or to get an in-person visit today. After even recovering from the pandemic, in the state I'm in, it's pretty much under control, but other states it's not. There's the fear that there's going to be less interest in doing research for rare disease with all these accelerated attention to getting a vaccine for COVID. So what's going to happen to the rare disease clinical trials that are out there? The other thing we've heard in talking to a lot of people that we interact with is researchers who now weren't going into the office. They had to get access to their files at home. And a lot of them had dedicated systems, so they really even couldn't get access to their patient files at home. And that was an issue because everybody, everybody just suddenly you weren't going into work anymore. So you didn't have time to prepare for that. The other thing was signing informed consent and the documentation needed for research. Until now, electronic signatures weren't really mainstream recognized as being okay for doing that. And then if you were in a clinical study and there had to be visits for administration of the medication, people couldn't come into the study centers, so they had to make plans for nurse home visits to deliver medication. And the same thing goes for lab tests. I was part of a clinical study, and they sent me my box full of my sample A, sample B, and I was told to take the samples into a Quest lab to get tested. And then there's, for people with rare disease who are going for a lot of procedures all the time, like IVIG or plasmapheresis or other procedures, how does that go? It's not so easy to get into outpatient procedures right now. And then in general, there's less travel for anybody to get anywhere, and there's more telehealth visits that are taking place. So some of the challenges we learned. So everybody now has been working virtually. A lot of people have been working virtually. If you're not 100% virtual, you're maybe 50 or 25% virtual. Even if you're in an advocacy group, I'm sure that you're communicating more than ever, and you're not doing as many walks and events, just like this one, in person. So how does that affect productivity and the interaction of teams? That's something Gerald's been very involved in. And then how do you keep engagement? If you're not face-to-face, are we losing something? And then there's a lack of supplies. If people aren't, especially for things like IVIG and transfusions, if people aren't getting in to be able to get those supply things going, how is that going to happen? What's going to happen? I mean, some of these things have been set back because of the pandemic. And how do we make sure that doesn't happen in future? And then, all these clinical studies that are all recruiting been trying to catch up. How are we going to have enough access to participants? And how are we going to be able to retain participants if you can't always go into study centers? And then there's also the fear of not having, if money is focused on getting a vaccine or a treatment for corona, what about the money that's going to be available for rare disease studies? And how are we going to manage, how do clinicians, we've heard this from a lot of doctors we talk to, of trying to manage the overflow of patients that they couldn't see during the shutdown and now are their bread and butter. And then they have to, balance that with getting patients in and seeing patients as part of the clinical trial. And then on the sponsor side, sponsors are used to sending people out to monitor the treatment, to find out about patient follow-up and to help out. And all that is stopping now with all the travel restrictions. And then lastly, how do we get to the FDA if the FDA is very taken up on prioritizing, as they should, corona vaccines and treatment? What's going to happen to the response time of the FDA for all the other treatments that are in the pipeline? So as I mentioned, we talked about a lot of the challenges here. Some are the technical challenges, the hardware challenges, and some are the software challenges, which are the people challenges. So Gerald's going to talk a little bit about some of the people challenges of the new reality we're living with. Gerald?
Okay, so thank you, Nina. Yes, thank you, Nina. Again, as I said, it's a pleasure to be with you all. As the reality that Nina just mentioned and the challenges that she first went over, now I will really just take a moment to remind you, as we kind of set up a discussion, that as you prepare to think beyond, I call it the hardware, the what's, and how you do the trials, the mechanics and the processes of the trials, conducting it, all those things are important. But really, I wanted to try to get a focus on what I like to call that software. Anita mentioned it. And the software is really the people component. There are challenges around the people component, and it's after spending over 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry, as I told you, and working with teams, I basically realized that the people aspects are really what can drive and make things or break things. And so I think it's so important for us to spend the time to focus on how we can make sure we keep that in our mind, keep it front and center. The truth is that this is important even in normal times. But it's really exacerbating, enhanced even more so in these times. And I suspect you're all feeling it and experiencing it in different ways. We just don't always think about it up front, and you have to plan for it. So that first statement, I would say, Nina, if you go to that next slide here, oops, sorry about that. If you go to the next slide, if the first statement up here at the top, the idea that successful outcomes can really be derailed or interfered, not because you're not doing things in the right way, but sometimes it's the what? It's actually the people components, the interpersonal dynamics that can slow things down. Even if you're successful, you're going to be less successful when those things aren't. And I say more specifically, issues that are around trust, around effective communication, and really around style differences and how we perceive each other differently and how we don't, and how the interaction happens there. So lack of either one of these is really going to have some dramatic consequences, again, whether it's normal times or whether it's now. But particularly now, you have to pay attention to it. It seems obvious, but unfortunately, oftentimes it's not really considered, and things happen down the road. So in terms of preparing, we really want you to think about that. Now, let me look at this trust first. It's a word that's kind of generic, and we use it all the time. But when you look at trust, and when you look at interacting the way we are right now, it's very important. And there are different components of trust. Let me just say, for instance, we talk about the credibility and reliability. knowing that facts are right and things are correct. If you think about people who you don't know or you're not interacting, sometimes that's something that always has to be questioned. So credibility and reliability, can you really count on, in the same way we can when it's in normal times, things happening? So being able to depend, to rely, and to know what you're looking at kind of predictively is really what that first component of trust really is. It's predictive trust. Oftentimes that's all we think about it, but there's also another piece that's so important. And that's this idea of feeling safe and open, kind of feeling vulnerable enough to speak and open up your mind to say what you want. And this is a big challenge that we have in this setting right now. Often you don't know people, you don't feel as comfortable. You may not do what I call release your thought bubble. Things may stay inside. You're not challenging, or you may not even be admitting something that's an error or something you don't understand. For technology, for instance, having a difficulty in technology is just one. But if you trust someone, if you know them, the people you go to, think about that the same thing. So we have to think about these things after planning it. And then here's another piece that people don't always think about with trust. Just the idea of caring and knowing that someone cares and that they're spending their time and attention focused on your needs equally or more so than their own. And so those are all components that you want to think about. Timing, reaching people, going to what their thoughts are and thinking about them is a big piece of trust. And those three together, credibility and reliability, the idea of openness, are very important. And then communication, clear, open, frequent, respectful. Things to think about and really look at when you're considering that one. And they're tied to trust. And then finally, tied to both of these is this idea of style differences and recognizing the fact that, people generally assume that other people interact the same way we do and think the same way we do, when oftentimes it's not true at all. You don't know them. And imagine what it's like now when you don't know anyone and you're making assumptions. And once again, the majority of issues with interaction start with style differences and work style differences and basically differences of the way we view things. So differences of style, unfortunately, can have a major result in perceptions of negative intent and things kind of go haywire. To think about something you're looking at when you're planning and when we're thinking about interacting with participants and also those colleagues that we're doing the studies. So this idea of proactive planning is something where we have to make some change. Processes, as Nina talked about, resourcing changes. We have to step up our game and really get with the technology. And when you don't understand it, again, interacting with people, having that trust. And those are the things that are critical. So I'm going to turn it over to Phuong at this point in time. And Phuong, well, you can tell us more about your experiences in this setting, how you've been affected in your environment, and some of the things you're adapting and you're doing to really make success happen. So I'll turn it over to you.
So Phuong's going to talk a little bit about what has been the key learnings from the COVID studies. Like what can we take, what are the good that we can take out of the changes from the COVID studies? Phuong, are you there? Phuong? I think you're still on mute. Well, I think I just want to mention also while Phuong is getting her mic together, I just want to mention I do see some questions here, one for Gerald and one for Phuong, which we'll get to. And maybe Gerald, you can respond a little bit to one question that was about your slide, which is you're talking about this virtual interaction. How does that, building trust, How is that going to happen when you're trying to do it? Any thoughts for what the best practices might be to build that trust and that relationship when you're trying to interact or get or make connections to a strategic partner, where you're looking to try to, create a partnership for research, and you basically don't know each other and you're trying to introduce each other but build that level of trust? Any thoughts on that, Gerald?
Okay. Yeah, this is a question that's asked a lot and actually very basic. And surprisingly, one of the easy answers is that it's no different. You have to get to know people. When I talk about the number one rule in trust, number one is having positive intent and spending time together. And people that I'm finding in teams that I'm working with now, clients, we're encouraging to incorporate sessions, even when they know people, to learn other things that are happening in their lives. But when you don't know people, it's very important to take the time to get to know them. And one of the things I didn't mention about trust is that obviously you're not going to feel you can open up when you don't know someone as well, but you have to spend the time and take the time to get to know them. That's really number one. And then there's this expression, giving trust builds trust. So when you feel comfortable, the more you can get to the point where you can empty your thought bubble and speak your mind, that's going to be, honestly, the two biggest things that are going to build trust. Is getting to know people, and then you giving trust yourself, being vulnerable.
Okay, Phuong, thanks.
That's fine.
Gerald. Okay, so Phuong, why don't you talk about some of? Before you go, why don't you go ahead and tell us some of the things that you think we've learned from the COVID-19 studies and what's been going on from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Nina. Certainly, the COVID pandemic has placed a tremendous strain on the clinical research enterprise, not only at our hospital, but in talking to my colleagues across the country, we're all in this place. However, the fast and effective readjustment to address these new challenges have introduced new innovations that I think will advance the conduct of clinical research well beyond the end of the pandemic. And if we could take a page from the COVID-19 study as a template, playbook, if you will, as a template for how we approach rare disease trials of high priority in the future, I think there's a lot to learn. First and foremost, what we saw with COVID studies was a shared sense of urgency and purpose. Across the institutions and teams, there was a commitment to pursue answers to COVID-19. We saw that study teams formed very quickly, multidisciplinary teams mobilized at record speed. People found each other and commit to working together very quickly. We saw that our IRB, given the material change in the risk and benefit analysis, very quickly came together to prepare a fast-track mechanism to expedite the review and approval of COVID-related studies. And we saw that teams were able to prepare these applications very quickly. We also saw that when it comes to contract negotiations and financials related to studies, we were able to accelerate the contracting and budgeting process. Communications happened very quickly amongst all stakeholders in the life cycle of the study. And some of these communication cycles were updated on a daily basis. And lastly, we saw a unique way of approaching clinical trials where teams readily share resources. So the use of a master trial protocol was much more common. And the idea here is that if there's an existing study that could be amended to support other research questions, that was done so that there isn't a new protocol written and put in the queue for implementation each time there was a research question being asked. So that may be a tool that we can leverage in the rare disease space as well. And then we also saw that the approach to study design was a little bit different. It was a focus on leaner and faster trials. We have a tendency in clinical research to start with the research question and then very quickly add on to it a lot of ancillary data collection, secondary objectives, et cetera. And before you know it, the protocol becomes very large, the data burden in terms of collection is very large on the study participants. So these are some of the characteristics that we observe with COVID studies at our site that I think we can take from and leverage as we think about the design and conduct of rare disease trials. Next slide, please.
Okay. I just wanted to mention one thing that Gerald always points out, that if you think about all those shows like Lost, when everybody's on a desert island and everybody has to rally together to get off, there's a lot better sense of collaboration and putting aside a lot of protocols to do it. So that's kind of the mentality you're kind of talking about when you talk about the COVID-19. And somebody said Operation Warp Speed for rare disease, please. And I think that's, applying that. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I think what we sense with this renewed sense of energy and purpose to use science to solve problems that are important to our patients and the public. And that's certainly true with COVID-19, but the same can be said about rare diseases, right? So I think that we can really harness and leverage that shared renewed energy and translate that to the conduct of rare disease trials. I want to share with you some of the positive changes that we have observed and implemented at institutions that I think will serve rare disease trials well beyond the pandemic. And the IRB fast tracking, which I hinted at earlier, we have a sense of fairness in research operations that tend to equate to first in, first out, whether it's contracting, IRB, feasibility assessment, et cetera. And when it came to COVID studies, we were very willing to skip the line, if you will, for these high priority studies. I'm advocating that we reconsider that sense of fairness when it comes to rare disease trials. First trials, and what is a priority will be determined, I'm sure, by each institution. But I think for trials where there are no existing treatment for a patient population or no adequate treatment, that's a no-brainer. For studies where we have patients that are waiting for something transformative, that's, I think, justifies the fast-tracking approach. So our IRB at our children's hospital had shown that they can do this. They can set up a fast-track mechanism. We had ad hoc meetings as needed for COVID studies. We certainly can have ad hoc meetings for a rare disease trial that needs this kind of expediency. The acceptability and use of telehealth. The technology for telehealth has been around 10, 15, 20 years. The barriers to incorporating telemedicine more widely into clinical practice and in clinical research has largely been administrative and bureaucratic. We saw this when the pandemic hits, right? Suddenly, we were able to very quickly roll out telemedicine technologies across our hospital enterprise, including in clinical research. And what was surprising to us was that we took a pulse check recently where we had patient satisfaction results come back for both inpatient as well as a number of our outpatient as well as a number of our primary care services. And the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Our positive scores were in the 90s across all of these areas. So our patient population welcomed this introduction of telemedicine technologies. And we've seen it with our trials. We're able to consent that way. We're able to look at certain visits where we could conduct through telemedicine versus having the subject come on site. We've devised things like home-based testing and monitoring technologies, curbside or courier pickup and delivery of participant samples and investigational products. The design of the trial pre-COVID and the approach of implementing the study has been very much patient and subject on-site focus. That's just the paradigm, right? You write a study and you have the patients come. With rare disease population, many times we're the only center for a study that serves a geography, and these families drive to our center to access these trials. And we should be mindful of the burden that we create for our study participants and their families. And because we're a pediatric hospital, the child comes with the family and sometimes with siblings. So our demand that these visits happen on site has this downstream effect on the quality of life for our research participants. And we've seen that telemedicine can serve a purpose, and some of these new innovations and approaches not only have allow us to continue to gather data, but we believe it's resulting in an improved satisfaction, improved experience for our research participants. Digital data collection tools. There are many we've introduced that's worked well. We work with our sponsors on remote site initiation visits, as well as ongoing monitoring activities. And overall, we believe that we have been less reliant on expecting that the participants come to our hospital to participate in studies.
Yeah, I think we've had some interesting questions that are coming up here. So I'm going to just give you the first one, Phuong. That
Sure.
Somebody had asked whether or not, how does planning for a children's hospital, in your experience, is it different from planning from an adult hospital? Are there different considerations? You touched on that a little bit when you were talking about, the burden on parents and things like that.
Yes, certainly. Children have schools that we have to contend with, the kinds of visits that we do and the frequency we think about what else is the child doing in his or her life, first and foremost. So the need or the desire for keeping the patient on site for long periods of time is challenging. With rare disease studies, I've seen visits that last 8 hours, so sometimes 12 hours long. These are outpatient visits, not a hospital admission. So that is something that we consider. We also consider the impact on the family. As I shared with you, we do serve as a site where out-of-area patients do come. And because we're a children's hospital, we have to think about the entire family. Who's the child coming with? And the living arrangement around that. The consenting process is very unique, depending on the age of the child. And then we have to facilitate conversations amongst family members as needed, depending on where they're at in terms of their thinking about a study. It's not uncommon that we have a teenager, someone old enough to understand what's happening with their health and their care, that may have a different view than their parents about their participation. So we have to facilitate that. So there are a number of areas that might be different, and then certainly under the regulatory requirements, what we're obligated to do at the IRB level in terms of reviewing pediatric trials has some added components under Subpart C of the Common Rule. The FDA has some consenting requirements for pediatric studies depending on the risks and benefits. So those are some general comments, but if there are specifics that anyone wants to delve into, I can certainly comment more.
Okay, thanks. One of the other questions that had come up that I think is a very important one is the access that people may have to technologies that allow for virtual visits or other technology or some kind of diary studies. They may have electronic diary studies or things like that. So how do we deal with people who live in very rural areas or may not have access to all the tools? And I'll just say from my point of view, I've worked a lot in areas, I worked with a Canadian group where we were looking at very, very rural areas of Canada where people are really too far to get to a clinician's office. And they embraced doing telehealth visits early on. And I think the one good thing that has happened in general about that kind of technology is none of us were really adept at doing any kind of teleconferences, webcams. I know that I've just going to the doctor recently, I've had to been doing our first visit. Most of the doctors in my area, I'm in New York City, they won't even see you until you do a telehealth visit first. So it's becoming more and more required. And actually we did some research and saw about 20% of all visits made on ZocDoc are now made for telehealth. But that telehealth can be done through the phone. So it doesn't always have to be a webcam or a Zoom call. It can also be a regular phone call that can happen or texting. So I think that being more flexible, I think, Phuong, when we were talking about this before, and Gerald, I think a common theme here that it's a positive change that when you're forced, like I said, like Gerald says, when you're on the island, what do you have to be? Number one is flexible. The old rules don't always apply. So I think that's one of the things that we're looking for is greater flexibility. So if people can't use telehealth or can't use some kind of electronic system because they're not adept enough at it or they're not comfortable with it, and their doctors who are not that comfortable with it, then there's the phone, which is a lower tech technology. Most people are comfortable with the phone or with texting. So there may be other ways we can address getting through to people that doesn't necessarily always have to be an in-person contact. And I think we have to work harder, particularly in rare disease, because rare disease people are spread all over the world. I mean, in my grandson's case, there are only 150 people in the world who have this condition, and about 4 or 5 of them are in the Philippines. So you're not going to, in a rare disease, you're not going to find somebody down the block or down the road. It's always going to be necessitating have to do these external communications or some kind of, we're enabled through the web, at least for a regular website, to get on. And that's what, when we built our platform for No Rare, that was one of our considerations. We really wanted to keep it a strictly web-based platform that would be easy for everybody to just go on, even if they had to go on their phone. So that's one of the questions that have come up. And I'm going to go to some of the questions that we have for the audience, and then we'll touch on some other things too. So first of all,
Nina, Gerald, I just want to interrupt just to add to what you just said. A trust component to what you were just saying. There's an expression that I use about going to other people's house, literally, going to their place. And it's part of that trusting I talked about focusing on someone else's needs, right? You're looking at it from your viewpoint. You have to go and find out. Take the time to ask, to understand, listen, know what their issues are. And if someone asks that question about building trust, that's one of the ways of doing it, is by asking and listening and doing that. So I think it's very important to know before you start offering things.
And Gerald, Nina, to add to that, I think we need to think about how to engage with our study participants in the language that they understand using telemedicine technology, right? So that's what we're dealing with right now at our site. While the technology is there, we can facilitate these conversations. How do we work in an interpreter? How do we work in a language service so that our families and patients can trust us in a language that they understand?
Right. And taking a lot of times it's going to schools, going to libraries, which we can't do that much right now in a pandemic, but in the past, sometimes they would, libraries would have sessions on how to work with to work on the web a little bit. I think there's some other changes. I think one other thing, Gerald, that has come up is sometimes there are interpersonal issues that get in the way of moving everybody off the island, let's say. So how do you, and you're trying to work with speed because you're trying to get something done. How do you slow the team down, or does the team have to slow down to address interpersonal issues? Do you have any recommendations on that?
Again, it's interesting how a lot of things come to the same answers. You have to take the time. So sometimes you do have to slow down. One of my favorite expressions is that sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. And that's true when it comes to relationships. It goes back to the style differences. There's some people who are faster and more impatient, and there's other people who have to be systematic and go slower. So if one person is picking one way, it won't work. So you have to do that.
And I think another question, like we're talking about here, is some things are going to be more difficult to make, and some changes are going to be more difficult to make. And I think, Phuong, you talked about it was very tough in the beginning to get your institution to embrace electronic signatures for a lot of these studies, right? But the pandemic kind of forced that to happen. So are there any other changes you think that are going to be difficult to make? Do you think some of the FDA study guidelines, a question came out. Do you think some of the changes that have happened with the FDA with speeding things along, do you think those are going to be sustained? Or do you think we're going to go back to the way thing was before?
I hope we don't. I hope that we sustain the gains that we have made to move toward more efficiency and to be able to approach clinical research in ways that are in terms of the design conduct is more streamlined and modernized. But having said that, I feel like in our relationship with industry, there are still drug and device companies that are very cautious about remote monitoring or remote site initiation visits. There is a sense of normalcy and compliance that I believe our partners believe that they can ascertain better if they're on site. And this is what Gerald said, right? Trust. We have to go back to that premise. I mean, if we are not a trusted partner, this can't happen. The technology is not going to bridge that. So I think that stands to be, tested. So we have some partners that very quickly jumped in and said, we've worked with you guys, you produce amazing data. This is a pivot and we're willing to do it. And we have other partners that says, if we can't come on site for an activation, then the study's not happening. So we've held off on those studies. They do have to be put in a queue now for when we're able to have visitors back at our hospital.
Right. And that goes to some of the questions about productivity and this virtual communication that we're going to be forced to do, whether it's with a sponsor, a funding source, a team member, getting advocacy people, like all those walks that everybody used to do to raise money. Is it going to be harder to do those kind of virtual events? Are we going to lose some intimacy and some momentum or efficiency? I don't know. So it's more like energy that keeps people motivated to doing clinical studies in rare disease. How do we keep the virtual communication? How do we ramp up the trust? Gerald, do you have any ideas for us on that?
I think
it's a tough one.
Everything starts by really, again, a broken record, going back to the person and knowing. But I do believe that where I see effective communication, there's sometimes a repetition, a process or a way of doing things a certain way, following almost like a recipe or format sometimes when you know what works. But there's also this concept of adapting to different people's styles and knowing what the one that works. There has to be this idea of a shared goal, right? A shared reward, shared consequence. And if you don't have that, then it's kind of difficult. So you have to spend the time to, once again, to understand those things. That's a tough one, though.
I know. But I think we have the opportunity, in a way that this pandemic gave us the opportunity to learn and to be prepared for the next one. And that's really our goal. That's what we should all be thinking about. And what advantages have we gained? And what will last with us for the future? And how can we adapt research, our research protocols? Can we build more flexibility in there so we won't be caught with our pants down the next time something hopefully terrible happens, so that people with rare disease, our hope is research. And not being able to do that research and not be able to get it funded or get it activated or get patients into the studies is really a problem for so many people who are really looking for this research to give them the kind of help and help them deal with the unknowns of their disease. So we really hope that some of these lessons learned will be taken into account, and we won't go back to the same old way, because as Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing things the same old way and trying to get a different result. So let's hope we take some learnings from there. I just want to open it up again. If anybody has any other questions, please post them and we'll try to address them. Otherwise, I want to thank both our participants, Gerald and Phuong, for a great discussion. And one other thing that Gerald did mention that I thought was really, really a good point, that when you're in a virtual session and you're trying to be very, you're trying to maybe if you turn off your visuals so they can't see your face, you'll feel more comfortable about being critical or being confrontational when you need to be. Is that one way you could do it? But we're going to have to develop a new set of cues, like you said, and styles in order for us to work more efficiently and to work better, because we're just getting used to working virtually. Is there a better way of doing this? So thanks for joining.
There's one thing I wanted to add to what you're saying. The clients I'm working with, one of the interesting little pieces of trust that's happened is by having the cameras on, being in people's homes, having the informal things like the kid jumping up in the lap. The person is it's such a humanizing thing. And that's been something that I've seen a trust builder in teams. So don't be shy about having your family being a bit more visible on things. It does help.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. It was a great session. And feel free to contact any of us with any questions.
Thank you, Nina.
Okay.
Thank you.